Okay, well, thank you all so much for joining us. Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you're dialing in from. I'm Hannah Lester, and I'm the CEO and Principal Consultant of Atova Regulatory Consulting. And I'm really excited to welcome you to our first part of our EU Novel Food Masterclass series. And in this 4-part series, we're going to share with you how to build an EU novel food dossier, along with sharing helpful tips and tricks that we have learned through our extensive collective experience over the past years. So this first session is really focused on pre-submission activities and the admin guidance. And then later parts are going to focus on specific dossier sections and really help you to build and present a compliant and robust dossier. So in terms of housekeeping, we will be recording this session so that it will be available afterwards, and we'll put it up on our website and on YouTube as well. We will share the slides with all of the participants after the meeting. Please keep your microphones muted. But do ask any questions that you have throughout the presentation in the chat function. So I can be replying to questions during the presentation, and we'll also leave some time for Q&A at the very end. We'll get through as many questions as possible, but if there are any that we haven't been able to address, we can follow up by email. So moving on, I'm very, very pleased to introduce my colleague, Hannes, who will be walking you through this first installment of our Novel Food Dossier Masterclass. So over to you, Hannes.
Thank you very much, Hannah, for the introduction. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all very much for attending this webinar. So maybe also a quick introduction on my side. So my name is Hannes Malfroy. I'm a regulatory and novel food specialist at Atova. I've been with the company now for over 3 years, but I have more than 8 years of experience in regulatory affairs. And so I have a lot of hands-on experience in submitting regulatory dossiers in multiple jurisdictions. But for this specific webinar, we will be focusing on the EU and in particular on novel food dossiers. So as Hannah mentioned, this webinar is part 1 in a series. And in this specific webinar, we will be focusing on strategic planning and admin requirements for a novel food dossier. So we will be giving you all kinds of tips and tricks when building the novel food dossier. So before we get started with the webinar, I would also like to give a quick introduction on Atova Regulatory Consulting for those of you who are not familiar yet with us. So we are a regulatory consultancy company based in Barcelona. We were founded back in 2022. And our main activity includes providing regulatory and scientific advice on novel foods and food innovation in general. We are trusted by over 80 clients, and amongst our technical team, we have submitted over 150 dossiers globally. So this includes the EU, but also Great Britain, the United States, Switzerland, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, and Canada as well. So with that being said, we can make a start with the webinar. So in this webinar, I will be focusing first on giving you all a brief introduction on the EU Novel Food Regulatory Framework, and then we'll go more into detail on all of the key steps that you should take in preparing a novel food dossier. So we will be giving you some tips and tricks, and then we'll focus on everything that happens once you hit the submit button. So we'll give you an overview of all of the whole post-submission process from submitting the dossier until the authorization. And then we'll finish with some take-home messages. So let's make a start with a quick overview of the EU Novel Food Regulatory Framework. I'll keep this short because I know most of you are already familiar with the regulatory framework. But just very quickly, so the key regulation in the EU Novel Food Regulatory Framework is the Novel Food Regulation, or Regulation 2283 of 2015. And this regulation defines what a novel food is. So novel foods, they are food ingredients that have no history of consumption in the EU before the 15th of May of 1997, or they are food ingredients that are produced with a novel production process that has not been used in food production before the 15th of May of 1997. The novel food regulation defines 10 specific novel food categories, and for your food ingredients to be considered a novel food, you should fall under at least one of these novel food categories. It is possible that your specific food ingredient falls under multiple novel food categories. Then it's up to the food business operator. So this is the company that is intending to market the food ingredients to assess whether their specific ingredient is considered a novel food or not. Then also in the context of novel foods, I would also like to introduce the subcategory of traditional foods. So traditional foods are food ingredients that do have a history of consumption, but outside of the EU. But for the scope of this specific webinar, we will be focusing on new novel food applications under Article 10 of the specific novel food regulation. Then I would also quickly like to introduce the two main institutions that are that play an important role in the context of novel food applications. So there's the European Commission and there's the European Food Safety Authority, or EFSA. So the European Commission is responsible for managing the EU novel food regulatory framework. They receive and coordinate novel food applications. They request scientific assessments from EFSA. Then they also make final authorization decisions together with the member states, and they maintain the EU Union list of authorized novel foods. Then on EFSA's side, they provide independent scientific safety assessments of novel foods. They advise the European Commission on potential risks and safe use conditions, and they also support science-based decision-making within the EU novel food framework. Then throughout this webinar, I will also be talking and introducing quite a lot of relevant EFSA and EC tools and sources that are important in the context of novel food applications. So in this slide, you see an overview of the most important tools and sources. So on the EC side, we have the EU Novel Food Status Catalog and the list of outcome of novel food consultations. So these two sources are important to use to assess the novel food status of your ingredient. There's also the Union list of novel foods. So this is a list of all of the novel foods that are currently authorized in the EU. And another very important tool is the e-submission food chain platform. So this is the platform that you will use to submit a novel food application. Then on EFSA's side, we have the EFSA toolkit. So the EFSA toolkit gives an overview of all of the EFSA tools and sources that exist. So one key tool is EFSA Connect. So EFSA Connect is actually a platform in which you can conduct all of the pre-submission activities, such as notification of studies. Another important source to mention is OpenEFSA. So OpenEFSA is a tool in which you can check all of the ongoing and finalized applications that have been submitted by EFSA. There's also the EFSA practical arrangements to the transparency regulation. I'll introduce that in a second in the next slides. There's also the catalog of EFSA guidance documents. So in this specific catalog, you can find an overview of all of the EFSA guidance documents that have been produced. There's also the EFSA catalog of supporting initiatives. There's the dietary exposure tool, or the Dietix tool. This is a key tool that you should use to estimate the dietary exposure to your novel food. And then lastly, I would also like to mention the EFSA journal. So in the EFSA journal, EFSA publishes any outputs that they perform. So think about EFSA opinions. Then in the context of novel foods, I would also quickly like to introduce the transparency regulation. So the transparency regulation was introduced to increase openness and public trust in the food safety risk assessment process, including the risk assessment process for novel foods. And this regulation has been applicable as of March 2021. So the transparency regulation strengthens the role of EFSA by improving transparency of scientific studies and data that were submitted in the context of novel food applications. So the transparency regulation has two main implications, I would say, when it comes to novel food applications, and that includes that applicants must notify all of the relevant studies that are commissioned for a novel food dossier, which basically helps prevent selective reporting of scientific evidence. And another implication of the transparency regulation is that a non-confidential version of the novel food dossier that you have submitted is being made publicly available. Then there are two key documents that lay out how EFSA practically applies the transparency regulation. So there is the practical arrangements, as well as the question and answers on the EFSA practical arrangements. So I would suggest to take a look into these two key documents when handling, for example, confidentiality of your novel food dossier. In this slide, there's an overview of how the novel food structure looks like, and this structure is laid down in this specific Commission implementing regulation, and there are more details on the novel food structure that you should follow in the administrative guidance for the preparation of novel food applications. So a novel food dossier should consist of administrative data, summary data. Then the most important part of the novel food dossier is a technical dossier. So in the context of this webinar, we will not be going through all of the specific data requirements of the technical dossier and the specific sections, but we will keep that information for one of our next 3 webinars. So the main idea of this webinar is really to give you some key tips and tricks that you should follow when you're preparing a novel food dossier. Then you should also include some references and a list of annexes and a checklist in your novel food dossier. Okay, so let's make a start with the pre-submission phase. So what are basically the key steps that you should be thinking about when you are preparing a novel food dossier? So in this first slide, I'll give an overview of all of the key steps, and in the next slides, we'll go into detail in all of these steps that I will be highlighting. So first of all, when you're preparing a dossier, you should plan your specific dossier, and we highly recommend to prepare a gap analysis and a regulatory plan. So in this gap analysis and regulatory plan, you should take a look at what data do you already have available, is that data usable to be included in the novel food dossier, and what data should still be generated. At this stage, we would also recommend to already conduct your literature search. So once you have conducted the literature search and prepared the gap analysis, you can start planning the production of the regulatory batches. And also at this stage, we would recommend to request general pre-submission advice from EFSA. So once you have your dossier planned, you can go to the next step, which would be the study notification. So here, the first step that you should take is create a pre-application ID in the EFSA Connect tool. And under this pre-application ID, you can notify all of your relevant studies to EFSA. And it is very important that you notify these studies before the study start dates to avoid possible penalties. Then once you have notified your studies, you have conducted the studies, you can start generating the data. So at this stage, you would gather all of the analytical data and the study reports, and you should perform a quality control. So once you have all of the data, you can get started with the dossier writing. So this would be the scientific dossier, as well as the preparation of all the administrative documents. And once all of these are finished, you can start compiling the confidential versions and the non-confidential versions of your dossier. So once that is all prepared, you can move on to the dossier submission phase. So this would be submitting. So this would be uploading all of the relevant documents to the e-submission food chain platform and submitting those. Okay, so let's get more into detail in all of the steps that are required or that we recommend to be doing during the novel food dossier planning. So first of all, it is very important to identify all of the relevant EFSA guidances that would be applicable for your ingredients. So when it comes to novel foods, there are two main guidance documents. So there's the administrative guidance for the preparation of novel foods, as well as the guidance on scientific requirements for an application for a novel food dossier, basically. So these are the two key guidance documents, but then depending on the nature of your ingredient, many other guidance documents might also apply. So in total, there are more than 30 guidance documents that might be applicable to your specific novel food. So it's very important that you would do your homework and you check all of the specific guidances that might be applicable in order to prepare your gap analysis. I would also like to highlight that there is a catalog of EFSA guidance documents. So this is a very helpful tool that can help you identifying the key guidance documents that would be applicable for your specific novel food. So once you have identified all of the relevant guidance documents, you can start preparing your gap analysis and regulatory plan. As I highlighted before, make sure that this gap analysis and regulatory plan is ingredient specific, applying the specific guidance documents. And here you should take a look at what studies or data do you already have available. Can you use these data for your novel food dossier? And what additional data still needs to be generated. In parallel with preparing the gap analysis and regulatory plan, we would also highly recommend to already perform a systematic literature review. So this literature review should be performed according to this specific EFSA guidance, which was published in 2010. And so depending on what your novel food specifically is, so depending on the characteristics and the production process of your novel food, you should prepare a plan for what you want to analyze in the systematic literature search. But overall, the main items that are checked in a systematic literature review include history of consumption, as well as potential substances of concern. Also, you should check if there's any toxicity data on file or available in the literature. Are there any human data, and is there any information available in the public domain on allergenicity? So, for example, if you want to put a novel food on the market that is derived from a specific plant source, then, for example, from the literature search, you could identify that this specific plant source produces specific anti-nutrients. So that is then important to take into account for your gap analysis, that you would also test for these anti-nutrients in your list of studies. Another example could be, for example, a novel food that is produced by fermentation. So in that specific case, you should, in the literature review, take a look at the production organism and check if the production organism doesn't produce any secondary metabolites, for example, that could be of concern. And if your production organism could produce those, then it would also be good to test for these in your novel food. So once you have prepared the gap analysis and the systematic literature review, you can prepare a final list of all of the studies that you want to conduct in relation to the novel food dossier. So once you have this final list of studies, it is important to take a look at whether your study requires a notification or not. In one of the future slides, and the upcoming slides, I will give an overview of which studies do need notification and which do not. And also at this stage of preparing the final list of studies, it's important to think about laboratory selection. So in general, it is preferred that an internationally recognized or nationally recognized method is employed. And if for a specific parameter that you want to analyze, there is no internationally or nationally recognized method, then an internal method can be used, but you should be aware that if you select a laboratory that will use a internal method, that you should also provide a method description and a validation report. So this is also important to check this with, once you're at the stage of laboratory selection, that the laboratory would be willing to provide that information. You should also check if the laboratory is accredited for the selected analytical testing that you're interested in, and you should also ensure that the laboratory can perform the analytical testing in the relevant food matrix that you want to test. So once you have the final list of studies, you have selected all of the labs that can perform all of the studies, you can go ahead with planning the production of the regulatory batches for the novel food dossier. So for a novel food dossier, you should produce 5 independent regulatory batches. You should also think about the production scale. So in general, EFSA prefers to see batches produced on industrial scale, but EFSA is also aware that in some cases it's not possible to produce batches on industrial scale. So pilot scale would also be accepted, but if you would go for pilot scale, then you would have to justify why these batches would be representative for the industrial scale. So it's important that you would include that justification as well in the novel food dossier if you want to produce your batches on pilot scale. It is also key to make sure that once you produce the batches that you have sufficient amount of material available. So there's enough material from each batch to conduct all of the planned studies. So overall, we would highly recommend that for each batch, you have sufficient material for all of the testing. And then additionally, we would recommend to save some material. So for example, you can freeze some material in case later on, after submitting the dossier and in the risk assessment, EFSA would require some additional testing on the batches that you have presented. Okay, so once you have planned all of the regulatory batches, we would recommend to create a pre-application ID. A pre-application ID can be created in the EFSA Connect tool. It is fairly simple to create a pre-application ID. You just click a few buttons in the EFSA Connect portal, and you need to provide some information on your specific novel food, who is the food business operator, and then a general description of what your novel food is. So within this pre-application ID, you can notify all of the studies for your future novel food application that you will be submitting to EFSA. Also, through the pre-application ID, you can request general pre-submission advice from EFSA. So what is general pre-submission advice? So in general pre-submission advice with EFSA, you can ask questions that you may have on your specific application that would be arising during the pre-submission phase. I would also like to highlight that this general pre-submission advice is limited in scope, since EFSA cannot provide specific advice on, for example, study design. EFSA can also not comment on specific requests on how to develop and manage a study, and EFSA can also not validate study protocols. However, we would highly recommend to apply for general pre-submission advice with EFSA, mainly to let EFSA know that a future application is upcoming, and also to introduce your company and your novel foods to EFSA. When should you request general pre-submission advice? Basically, this can be requested at any time, but preferably at least 6 months before the submission. So as I mentioned before already, you can request this general pre-submission advice through your pre-application ID in EFSA Connect, and the required information that would be needed to request the general pre-submission advice is some background information on your novel foods, your list of specific questions, and also some information on the conditions of use or the intended uses. So these are the food categories that you're intending to market your novel food in. And then based on this information that you've provided, I will then decide whether to provide general pre-submission advice via email communication or in a teleconference. So once you have created your pre-application idea, you can start with the production of the batches. One thing that I would like to highlight is we've seen that some of our clients, or this is not very clear to our clients, is that you don't need to notify your batch production. It's the studies that are applicable to your novel food dossier that should be notified. So batch production does not need to be notified, but what you should ensure is that you produce a minimum of 5 independent batches. So what are independent batches? Batches are considered independent when they are produced with different batches of raw materials. We know that in some cases this might not be possible. So for example, think about novel foods that are produced with a continuous fermentation process. It might not be possible to produce batches. It might not be possible to produce batches with different batches of raw materials, but as long as you can justify why you consider these batches are independent, and you include that in the novel food dossier, that might be accepted by EFSA, as long as you can provide a justification. So yeah, once you have thought about your batch production, then you should think about study notification if it would be required for your specific study. So which studies need notification and which do not need notification? So studies that do not need notification include compositional analyses. So think about impurity testing. Also, whole genome sequencing does not need notification. Physical chemical analysis do not need notification. Validation of analytical methods do not need notification, and other desk-oriented studies, such as bioinformatic analyses, they also do not need notification. So which studies do need notification? They include stability testing, digestibility, cytotoxicity, genotoxicity, ADME studies, toxicology, and allergenicity studies. Those studies would require notification. One thing that I would like to highlight is that stability studies, they do need notification, while compositional analyses do not need notification. However, if you would like to use part of your batch-to-batch variation, your compositional analysis as part of your time point 0 in the stability study, please make sure that this is also notified. So what information do you need to put into the EFSA Connect portal to notify a study? So you need to provide the start date, the planned completion date, study title and objective, the laboratory that will perform the analysis, and then the study standard accreditation. Laboratories in the EU, they also need to co-notify the relevant studies. So once you have notified your study, the laboratory will receive an email to co-notify the study. And I would also like to highlight that it's very important to notify the relevant studies before the study start date, as missing, incomplete, or incorrect study notifications can lead to administrative penalties. So once you have notified your studies, you can start the specific study. And I would also like to mention that So don't be afraid to notify your study and click the notification button, as study notifications can still be modified before the study start date that you have indicated in the notification. And before you start the study and you sample some of the material from the batches, I would also like to highlight that it's important to think about and document your sampling practices, as you should indicate this in the novel food dossier, and you should provide a rationale why the specific sampling practice that you have applied is considered representative for the entire batch. So don't forget to report your sampling practices. Okay, so once you have performed all of your studies, and you can gather all of the relevant results and perform a quality check. So when you receive the certificates of analysis from the laboratory, we would recommend to check if they are complete and they contain the relevant information. So that would include batch number and dates of production of the batch. Also make sure that for every parameter that is tested, there's a reference to the analytical method. Be sure that the certificates of analysis, they conclude the limit of detection and limit of quantification for each method, and make sure that the certificate of analysis includes the date of analysis. Along with the certificate of analysis, you should also provide the matrix accreditation and the scope of the accreditation of the laboratory. And as I mentioned before, if internal methods are used, then the laboratories should provide a full method description and a method validation. So also at the data generation stage, I would recommend to already perform preliminary dietary exposure assessments, just to make sure that all of the proposed uses that you're intending to apply for in the novel food dossier, they can be applied for. So at this stage, you should take a look if the intake of all of the compounds, so the dietary intake of all of the compounds in the novel food, are below set health-based guidance values that are referenced by EFSA. So this includes micronutrients, minerals and vitamins that have a tolerable upper intake level. So how does this work specifically? So you take your proposed uses, you perform a dietary assessment in Diatex, and you check what the exposure would be to your food ingredients. Then based on the dietary exposure to your food ingredients and your analytical results, you can take a look at the exposure to the individual nutrients, contaminants, and substances of concern, and verify whether these are below the set health-based guidance values from EFSA, so you can account for a safe intake. If you cannot account for a safe intake, then we would recommend to go back to the proposed uses and refine the proposed uses. So we either reduce them or also reduce the maximum inclusion rates that you were thinking about. And if this is not an option, then we would recommend to update the production process and see if you can reduce any of these substances. In general, we've seen that EFSA has been very hot on manganese intake. So yeah, at this stage of the data generation, I would highly recommend to perform a preliminary dietary exposure assessment, especially to manganese, and check if you can account for a safe intake of manganese through your ingredients. So once you have gathered all of the relevant information, you can go ahead with the dossier writing. When you start writing the dossier, please make sure that you carefully follow the administrative guidance from EFSA. So a novel food dossier consists of administrative data. So you should include key and administrative information in this section. So that would be the name, description, and the novel food category of your novel food, who is the applicant, some contact details of the relevant person that is responsible for the dossier submission, contact details on the producer or manufacturer. You should also indicate whether your dossier contains any confidential information. I'll give a more in-depth overview of the confidentiality in one of the next slides. You should indicate the scope of the application, whether data protection applies. I will also explain what data protection is in one of the next slides. You should indicate the proposed entry in the union list and if there's any regulatory status outside of the EU. The administrative data also should contain a cover letter, and please make sure that this cover letter is prepared according to the template that you can find in Annex 1 of this Commission implementing regulation. So then moving on to the next key part of your novel food dossier, which would be the summary data. So when you prepare the summary data, make sure that this does not contain any confidential information, since this summary will be made publicly available on Open EFSA. Then the most important part of the dossier would be the technical dossier. So when you prepare the technical dossier, make sure that you prepare this in accordance with all of the relevant EFSA guidance documents that are applicable to your specific ingredient, and also make sure that you provide a clear and structured narrative. So describe what was done and why in the context of your novel food dossier, present the results, but also interpret the results and ensure that the dossier is basically logically consistent and doesn't have any gaps in your safety narrative. Then when it comes to references, I would also like to highlight that EFSA wants to see a full text version of all of the bibliographic references or published studies that you reference throughout the dossier, also all of those that you included into the literature review. So we take this into account when you prepare the novel food dossier, that you should have the full text version. And you should also prepare a list of references that should be prepared in alphabetical order. And then lastly, also EFSA wants to see some annexes, some checklists. So you should prepare a list of annexes that you have included throughout the technical dossier. So you should prepare a list of all of these annexes, and also you should fill out some of the key checklists. So there is Appendix A to D. Appendix A would be a suitability checklist to check if all of the information that is needed is part of your novel food dossier. Appendix B would contain some general information for novel foods that are a new nutrient source. So you don't need to fill in this specific appendix if your novel food is not a new nutrient source. Appendix C would be a summary table of all of the statistically significant observations in your 90-day rodent studies. So also, if you didn't include a 90-day rodent study in your application, you don't need to fill out the specific appendix. And then I would also like to highlight Appendix D, which is the novel food product characterization template. And on this specific appendix, I would like to give you, or I would like to highlight this specific appendix, since this is a new appendix that should be prepared in Excel format, and all of the applications that are submitted as of January 2026, they should contain this appendix. Be careful, because preparing this appendix is very labor intensive to complete. It is very thorough, so applicants should in this appendix include all of the information on the novel food production the novel food characterization. So all of the parameters that you've tested in your batch analysis should be highlighted and should be selected from a drop-down menu. This could be very labor intensive. For example, if you are testing for the fatty acid profile, then you should really select all of the fatty acids that you have tested for. You should provide information on the batches, on the methods, as well as on the analytical data. So when you prepare a novel food dossier, take this Appendix D into account. It is a lot of work to fill out this specific appendix, so I would recommend to start compiling this Appendix D as soon as possible as you have received the results. Okay, so then I would also like to highlight the concept of confidentiality. As I've mentioned before, once you submit a novel food dossier, a non-confidential version of your novel food dossier will be made publicly available on Open EFSA, and it is up to the applicants to request confidentiality treatment. So basically, applicants, they must indicate which parts of the dossier should remain confidential at the time of submission, and you should also provide sound justifications why this information is considered confidential. So which type of information can be kept as confidential throughout your dossier? That includes personal data, manufacturing process information, detailed description of the composition, and a detailed analytical information, variability and stability of individual production batches. But please be aware that confidentiality cannot be or will not be granted to any data that is relevant to the safety of the novel food. So once you're assessing the confidentiality of your novel, of any information in your novel food dossier, I would highly recommend to take a look at these two sources, so the practical arrangements and the Q&A to the practical arrangements, to make sure that it is all being taken care of correctly. So when it comes to confidentiality, there are 8 specific confidentiality grounds that you should take into consideration. So if the specific information that you want to claim as confidential does not fall under a specific confidentiality ground, then EFSA cannot accept this as being confidential throughout your dossier. So once you have prepared the dossier, it is very important that for each document that contains confidential information, you should prepare a confidential and a non-confidential version. So in the confidential version, you should highlight all of the information that you consider confidential, and in a non-confidential version, that information should be redacted. And it is the non-confidential version of the document that will be published in Open EFSA. Then moving on to data protection. So you also need to indicate in your novel food dossier if any studies that you have performed fall under, or you want to request data protection for these studies. So data protection can be requested for any newly developed proprietary scientific data that you have gathered, that you have introduced for your novel food dossier. So the scope of data protection basically prevents that others cannot make use of your specific data, or they cannot refer to your specific data, and data protection applies for a period of 5 years. So which data can be protectable? So that includes toxicological and safety studies, stability, and the manufacturing process and composition. So what is the implication of data protection? Basically, you should consider that novel food authorizations are generic and they are linked to a specific applicant. So once your novel food is authorized, any company can produce the specific novel food and put it on the market if they meet the specifications, unless data protection applies to the authorization. So if data protection applies, then another company cannot use this initial authorization for a period of 5 years. However, that does not prevent them to submit their own novel food dossier with their own data. So it's not market exclusivity. And then also data protection is not the same as confidentiality. With data protection, the information will be in the publicly facing dossier, while if you apply confidentiality, that information will be redacted in the dossier. Okay, so once you have written your dossier, you have prepared all of the annexes, and you have prepared the confidential and non-confidential versions of your dossier, you can submit your dossier through the e-submission food chain platform. Also be aware that this is very labor intensive because you need to upload each document separately. So this includes both the confidential and non-confidential versions. And basically what takes the most time is in the metadata. So once you upload the confidential annex, you really need to highlight what information is confidential, under which ground it is confidential, and which information in the annex is considered confidential, under which specific confidentiality ground. So it gets quite complicated if your specific confidential annex contains information that fall under multiple confidentiality grounds. Also I wanted to highlight that each annex should be uploaded in the relevant linked dossier section in the e-submission food chain platform. And when it comes to compositional data, you should upload a separate attachment that contains all of the certificates of analysis that corresponds to each batch. So in total, you should upload 5 attachments. And also it's important that these attachments start with the naming batch. If not, then the platform will not let you submit the dossier. So please make sure that the file name would be correct. Okay, so that was quite a lot of information. So once you have provided or you have uploaded all of your novel food dossier in the e-submission food chain platform, you can hit the submission button, and then the post-submission process will be started. So I will give a quick overview of the post-submission process from submission to authorization. So once you submit your novel food application, it will be received by the European Commission. The European Commission will then send a mandate to EFSA to perform the risk assessment. EFSA will only evaluate the safety of your novel food. It will not take a look into health benefits or environmental impact. EFSA will produce a EFSA opinion in which they evaluated the safety of your novel food application. And then it goes back to the European Commission, who will perform a risk management. So in the risk management, the individual member states, they will vote on the authorization of your novel food, for which you need a qualified majority. So 55% of the EU member states need to vote in favor to authorize your novel food, and they need to represent 65% of the EU population. And once that is complied with, your novel food will be authorized. Just very quickly on the authorization process and timelines. So you submit your novel food dossier to the EC. The EC will validate your novel food application. They have 30 days for that. And in this stage, they also consult with EFSA and ASLEM to provide or to conduct a suitability check. Once EFSA considers it suitable, then the European Commission will validate the application and send a mandate to EFSA to start performing the risk assessment, for which EFSA has 9 months. So 9 months would be the legal time frame. But during this 9 months, EFSA can also request additional information, or they can basically they can stop the clock basically and ask for additional information in the risk assessment. So overall, the average time that applications are under risk assessment with clock stop days would include 647 days on average. But we've seen that if we take the days that an application is under a clock stop out of the equation, that the average risk assessment time would be 222 days, which would fall under the legal timeline of 9 months. On average, EFSA requests 4.4 clock stops during the whole risk assessment. and usually in 2.2 on average in 2.2 of those clock stops, the applicant requests a extension. So after the risk assessment, EFSA moves on to, the EC moves on to the risk management phase, for which they have 6 months. And on average, we've seen that time from submission to authorization takes from 2 to 4 years. I see that we're running out of time, so I will go very quickly over this slide in which I wanted to highlight the EC validation and the EFSA suitabilities check. So in the EC validation, basically the European Commission assesses the administrative and legal completeness, and they also check if the correct regulatory pathway and dossier format have been applied. And during this stage, the EC will also consult with EFSA to perform a suitability check of the application. So once EFSA provides or performs a suitability check, they will verify if all of the studies were correctly notified. They will check the scientific completeness of your novel food dossier, and they will perform a quality and consistency check of your study reports. Once EFSA considers the application valid, then the EC will validate the application and you will move on to risk assessment. Just be very careful. If you didn't notify your studies correctly before the study start date, then in the validation phase, the application will be considered not valid. You will have to resubmit your application, and once you have resubmitted the application, the European Commission will apply a penalty of 6 months. So they will not touch the resubmitted application until after 6 months. Then also very quickly on the EFSA confidentiality assessment. So once you have, once the application is considered suitable and you move on to risk assessment, the dossier that you submitted, the non-confidential version of the dossier with the applicant redactions, will be uploaded on Open EFSA, and EFSA in parallel to the risk assessment will perform their confidentiality assessment. So they will assess all of the confidentiality claims that you've made throughout the dossier, and they will make a decision whether they agree or not with those confidentiality claims. They will get back to the applicant and see if the applicant would be okay with all of the additional information that would need to be disclosed to the public, and EFSA will come up with a final confidentiality decision. So once EFSA has performed or has provided the final confidentiality decision, then the novel food dossier will be republished with all of the information that EFSA considers necessary to be available in the publicly facing dossier, and public consultation will start. So the public consultation will be open for 3 weeks, in which the public can basically comment whether they have any concerns when it comes to the novel food application. During the risk assessment, as I said, EFSA can also request additional data. So in most cases, the applicant would need to submit new data. And right before the scientific opinion from EFSA is published, there will be also a confidentiality assessment of the additional information. And right before the scientific opinion is published, the dossier will be republished again on Open EFSA, containing all of the additionally submitted information as well. So then some take-home messages and overall tips and tricks. So what does EFSA want to see when you submit a novel food application? So first of all, make sure that you comply with all of the administrative requirements. If you do it this way, then you will minimize questions that EFSA will ask during the validation. Also, make sure that you show EFSA that you have done your homework, so apply all of the relevant guidance documents, and it is always good to reference EFSA to EFSA. Then I would also like to highlight that it's crucial to make sure that these sections on identity, production process, and compositional sections are very thorough and well explained. If you do so, then this will also minimize questions that come up during the risk assessment. So this goes hand in hand with the next bullet point. So make sure when you prepare the novel food dossier that this is comprehensive with a clear narrative, and it clearly describes what you've done and why, and you outline and interpret all of the results that are included in the novel food dossier. And then last but not least, I would also like to highlight that it's very important to carefully assess the confidentiality of all of the documents. If you carefully assess all of the confidentiality claims, this will avoid a lot of back and forth between EFSA and the applicant in the confidentiality assessment, and will also make the confidentiality assessment more smooth. And keep in mind that usually the timelines that EFSA provides to respond to during the confidentiality assessment are short. So that's why it's important to carefully assess the confidentiality. So finally, some take-home messages. So make sure that when you prepare a novel food dossier that you prepare a gap analysis and a regulatory plan at an early stage. So it's clear what the timelines will be, what the costs will be to bring your novel food to the EU market. And it is also important to estimate how much material you should produce for each regulatory batch to cover all of the required studies. I would also recommend to perform a preliminary exposure assessment to ensure that you can apply for all of the proposed uses based on the compositional data. Make sure that you notify all of the relevant studies to EFSA before the study start dates to avoid penalties. Also, do not underestimate the dossier preparation. So as I mentioned, during the preparation of this Appendix D is very labor intensive. So make sure that you start compiling that appendix early on, as well as submitting the dossier through the e-submission food chain platform can take a lot of time. So overall, please account at least 2 weeks to upload and submit your dossier in the e-submission food chain platform. And last but not least, I would also like to highlight that the authorization process in the EU is complex and timelines are long. But if you have a compliant data set and a robust dossier, it is possible to reduce timelines. So as a recommendation, I would avoid submitting a dossier that is not fully ready, as this will save you time in the long run during the EFSA assessment. So as I mentioned before, this webinar was a part 1 in a series of 4 webinars. So we have our next webinar coming up on the 29th of July, for which the registrations will be open soon. And the 2 following webinars will take place in September and in November, but the dates for these will be confirmed. Also, we will be recording all of the webinars, so if you're not able to attend a specific webinar, do not worry, we will make the recording available. And then I would also like to mention that our annual conference, the Regulating the Future of Food conference, will take place and is planned for spring 2027. So thank you all for listening, and yeah, let me know if there's any specific questions.
Thank you, Hannes. That was a very comprehensive presentation, and so much to try and cover in such a short time. I think we would be able to take one question if anyone has a question. There's not. Oh, hang on. So that's just thanks so much, Hannes, from Diana. So that's great. If anyone has any questions, please drop them in the chat. Otherwise, do feel free to reach out to us. Anything that wasn't clear or that you want, more details, then please feel free to send us an email. Otherwise, we very much hope to see you again in July. And as we've mentioned, we'll make the slides available and also the recording as well. So big thanks to Hannes. And yes, thank you all for joining, and we'll see you soon.